is fine, no? For her position. Okay, good afternoon, all of you. Today we are really privileged to have Dr. Poonam Prakash. You are very familiar with the name, and some of you have studied also under her.
No, I don't think I've taught this batch.
You didn't.
Not
You
this
took
batch.
the previous one.
COVID batch.
time. Okay, so Dr. Poonam Prakash, she is a professor in physical planning and head of the Department of Physical Planning at School of Planning and Architecture, SPA, Delhi. So, and she had done her doctoral research from SPA only on housing. So she has a lot of research and publications, and she has been teaching in SPA for the last 23 years. So she has co-authored with this book, which you will be looking after. I'll just show the book to you. This is a book, City Planning in India, 1947 to 2017. The other authors with her are Ashok Kumar and Sanjeev Vidyarthi. So they are not present over here. One, they are a little busy, but otherwise, ma'am is with us to have a discussion on this book. Now, you people have done a lot of book review. You are talking about the chapters, essays, etc. Now, this is a very interesting book. We also have it in our library. I was going through this book. So she will just give an overview of this book and whatever questions you have regarding any essay, regarding any terminology, or anything related to planning, because our first years MRQ you were doing our development plan for the urban villages, and the seniors you have already done. So I think it will be a very interesting talk. So the stage is for you.
Thank you, Sujay. So, thank you, everybody. Hot. So nice of you to come here, and it's really nice to be back in CCA because it's always gives you a feeling of nostalgic coming home. So I was thinking that maybe we could make it more interactive rather than I have a presentation and I can kind of go through it. But so let me just first tell you the context of why we wrote this book, right? So Ashok is with me at SPA, is currently the Dean Academics, and Sanjeev Vidyarthi is in US. He is teaching at University of Illinois, and so both of them had. So one of the things that we had been discussing for many years is that we did not have any comprehensive book for students to refer to. We would refer them with papers, and but there was nothing which was available on city planning which was comprehensive. So I think so. Initially, Ashok and Sanjeev met and they said, "Let's get together and write something," and then they roped me in, and that's how this was. I think 2017. I think, yeah, sometime around 2017. And some of the initial discussions were around that there is a lot of ground to cover. What should we leave out? What should we cover? We also wanted it to be a textbook, which means that we didn't want a lot of our own stuff to come in. So initial discussions were around that. How do we structure it? How do we, also introduce the concept. So what we have in this book is the initial part. We also have an appendix which kind of defines the terms that we are using, because we thought it would be helpful for students to, like if you're using a term like, let's say, equity planning, and what does it really mean? So we have an appendix for that. So the structuring mostly is chronological. That means we have covered something on starting from pre-colonial and colonial times, and then the periods that we have taken is till the late 60s, after independence to late 60s, then 60 to 80, and then 85, the post-liberalization period, and then from 2000 onwards to 2017. The reasons why we took these periods were, the shifts that happened during that period. So the initial periods after independence till late 60s were, we were all very hopeful about, we had just gotten independence and we wanted to, nation building was a major kind of area. But then 60s to 80s, we were kind of, there were economic slowdown, and so economic forces and the political forces had shifted. So that's how we kind of divided the periods, right? And then the economic reforms and all. That's how it goes. So the other thing that was important for us was in the book was that we did not want it to become purely where we are describing what plans were done, what was their land use and stuff like that. We also wanted to understand what shaped those plans. So we brought in a certain social and political context to planning, because, and I think that was one of the unique things that this book brings in. While there are other books which kind of tell you, let's say Chandigarh plan ke bare mein hai ya Delhi plan hai, but how planning fits into a larger socio-political context and economic context was something that we consciously we wanted to bring in. That we can't look at planning outside its context is one of the important things that we wanted to bring. So let me just kind of, these are the three broad areas that I'm going to cover today. How we define purpose of planning, what were the key planning frameworks in terms of institutions, laws, etc. And what are the key influential planning ideas over a period of time. Okay? So let me kind of ask you guys now here with the first question. Let's first have a kind of a discussion around these three things, and then we will talk about what we have discussed in the book. So what, according to you, would be a purpose of planning? And how do you think it has changed, let's say, from colonial times to today? Has it changed? If anybody could just put a thought to it, think about it. You can say whatever comes to my mind. इतना कुछ ज़्यादा सोच के बोलने वाली जरूरत नहीं. What, according to you, what is the purpose of planning currently in today's times? And how do you? Anyone else? Yeah. Yeah, that is how you're defining plan, right? Systematic development, frameworks. But for what purpose? One is systematic. Like in colonial times, do you think the purpose in colonial times for planning was different than in, let's say, after independence or in post-liberalization period? Is there any difference, you think?
Context, colonial, at their own context, they had their own ideas.
So what was their agenda for planning this? Target audience change. What was the agenda? थोड़ा step back वो करते हैं broad. Let's say railway lines, right? That was one of the major interventions in colonial times. What was the purpose? Right. Right. So the purpose was extraction of resources and shifting it back. So around that agenda, a whole lot of planning happened. That was one purpose. Second purpose also was the military purpose, right? The security or cantonments, civil lines, cantonments. So, so look at it. That larger political context had a certain agenda in which planning happened. So that is the first part of the this thing, right? Now, in after independence, what was the agenda? What could be the agenda? Now, extraction of resources is no longer our agenda, right? Because we don't have to send it to UK. So what?
Like Chandigarh is an example. So you lost the capital from Punjab, you need a new capital. You technically would come in from because of the partition. So you have to an administrative town like Chandigarh for this area.
Yeah, right. So one is this functional need that we have lost a capital, and what was the emotional and psychological need here?
You could showcase what India can become like over time.
Right. So there were two needs here. One was that we wanted to see these developments as symbols of nation building, like steel towns, right? Temples, they were called the temples of modern India. Your Chandigarh was also the identity. We wanted to develop a certain identity of modern India. What would be seen as modern? So the nation building became a purpose of planning after independence. So comprehensive plans, whatever. So there was that whole underlying this thing that this is in the purpose of nation building immediately after independence. So if you look at the whole urban debates and the urban discourses now how do you see the agenda for planning? Sustainability. Great, right? Sustainability is one, yes.
More functional.
Yeah, function. Amenities will always, in all the plans, you will see that. But I'm just talking that underlying the political agenda changes. You will still have systematic development of cities, you will still have facilities, but the political agenda shifts for planning. So we're just trying to understand how the political agenda shifts. So sustainability definitely is one of the agendas.
This focuses smart cities.
Yeah, so economic growth, those kind of things become your agenda, right? So let's just look at. So this is just to give you an idea of how we are defining planning here, which is so the big plans and small plans here basically are big plans are the ones that we as experts prepare. Right? And the small plans are ones which people on their own do things. And how the two fits is always a challenge for us. So initially we all thought that as experts we will tell something, we will do the plans, and that's how things will develop. But actually the reality tells us something very different. So there is always this contestations and negotiations happening with what people are doing on their own and what we imagine or envision for people to do. Right? So we start with the book basically starts with telling how we see planning. Right? What is our understanding of planning? So basically two characteristics that define planning, any planning, whether you plan your day or whether you plan a city, is that one, it has to be purposeful. It has to serve some purpose. And it has to be future oriented. It has to tell me what will happen in future. So these are the two characteristics of any planning, be it land use planning, be it your career planning, or be it your everyday plan. This is what I'm going to do by tonight. Okay. So, so this is one of the quotes that I'm just kind of taking from the book, which is intentional actions that people and institutions undertake as they seek to anticipate and adapt for an uncertain future. Right? So, of course, in our context, in our book, we are focusing a lot on institutions. But when you look at planning, you can look at it, what people are doing. Like if we'll take an example of Chandigarh, so when Chandigarh was planned, we never envisaged initially the ready markets, right? But they came, right? So people did something, then we had to accommodate it. We had to, as experts, we said, similarly, the construction labor camp, the labor camps that came. So how these plans mesh together will also determine how adaptive our planning is or how successful our planning is. Okay. So planning on its own, people say that on its own we don't have our own theory. We draw a lot from other traditions. And some of the traditions that we draw are these four traditions. So the social reform tradition is mostly drawn from disciplines of sociology, where we say that which talks about right to the city, justice, equity, So that's a tradition from where planning draws. Policy analysis component of planning is from mostly management and public administration. And so we draw from there. Social learning is basically, so policy analysis is, most of you do that, right? So planning draws in terms of the whole methodology of policy analysis. Social learning is basically where we are, again, it's all these first three are said to be more expert driven, top down. And the last one, which is your social mobilization, which combines various threads and other disciplines, basically where we come to this whole modern planning thought, rational plan making, where we say that through, so on one side we have rational plan making, which gets negotiated through stakeholders and other actors in planning, through which then the change is driven. So social mobilization stream is considered to be more progressive planning tradition, but our planning otherwise continues to derive from all the disciplines like economics, politics, management. And that is one of the weaknesses of the profession. People kind of criticize planning for that it does not have. If we say, okay, what is planning's own theory? Then we kind of have a lot of theories, but we don't have one theory. We have many. So that is both a plus and a minus. So that's something when students come to study planning, they need to be able to appreciate that, because it's a profession which draws from a lot of disciplines. Okay, so this is how the book is actually structured, where we initially talk about the introduction of the book talks about these traditions of planning, what is a city, and those kind of discussions, and then we divide the book into these uh, three broad periods, and within that we have four four chapters, and all right. So this is kind of it kind of gives you an idea of I think it's slide the 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 chapter which is on the pre-independence chapter, right? It gives you an overview of the pre-independence chapter. So, what was the broader social context at that time, which changed up to 1800 to, and then from 1800 to 1947? If you look at the context, how that has changed, and similarly, how then the planning purpose changes because of that. So, if initially we were like in the princely states and there were agrarian communities, so we talk about the medieval cities, towns. The purpose there was very different, right, of a medieval town than when we come to the colonial rule. Okay? And the key planning features, if you look at, key planning features also change as the context changes. So here the medieval towns are small in scale, and you almost it's like a close knit communities. Right? You have certain caste based or occupation based communities organized in a large, but that is no longer the case when we talk of colonial this thing, because colonial cities put not necessarily the caste-based communities, but they bring in a notion of class-based hierarchies. Right? If you look at the New Delhi, the all your which is now the bungalow zone. If some of you are familiar with Delhi, and so all the government housing of that time, which is still there, so they were all rank-based. So you bring in a certain class-based hierarchy over an already existing caste-based hierarchy that Indian society had. Right? So we add another layer to it. You can please, in between, if you feel like asking something, please feel free to do that. So this is now where the main part of the book starts, which is modern town planning, particularly after independence. So we look at what was the context at that time of urban, what we consider as urban. Now, if you look at the population, so population actually almost. So basically, the point here is that the growth was really rapid between 1921 to immediately after independence, 1941. But particularly, if we look at growth rate of urban, which is in 1951, right? So total growth rate of population was 13%, but your urban growth rate was 41%. This is immediately after independence. However, even in the decade previous to that, there is urban growth happening. It's not like it's just happened because of independence. There is already a shift happening to cities, which is even if you look at your 1931 to 41 decade, it's 31% compared with your overall growth rate of 14%. So However, partition, of course, was a big factor in the movement to cities. But before partition, also, in 1942, we had a health survey done. Right? It was called War Committee Report, which did a survey of various cities, and they recommended that town planning needs to be done. And that's how immediately after independence, town planning did become an important, not very important yet, but it did kind of mention, the 5-year plans mention that we need to have laws for town. Before that, we don't have any town planning law. And I'll just come to that in a minute. So this is, of course, a decade of hope, right? So we've just gotten our independence and we really want to do something. Like it's like setting up anything new, right? New house, new institute, so there is that whole element of hope here. And of course, this is a very famous quote of Pandit Nehru. Most of you would be familiar with it. If not, that I think it's on his independence speech that he gives this, that a moment comes which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from old to new. So we create. So there is that पूरा एक माहौल है उस टाइम पे कि चीजें बदलेंगी. And then we now have a lot of interesting things happening here. There are 3 prominent people here: Nehru, Patel, and Ambedkar. Right? So the decision to adopt centralized planning is not something it is not going uncontested here. So the development idea of Patel and Nehru and Ambedkar are not, and even Gandhi for that matter, are not the same. They are different, right? So Gandhi wanted to focus on rural more. Ambedkar was saying no rural at all, because it's a den of people who are just oppress the lower caste. So I don't want. So there is this whole ideological as well as political debate happening, that in which direction do we take development? How do we do it? Should we focus on the urban? Should we focus on the rural more? So it's not like कि अच्छा वो we say कि centralized planning हो गया, uncontested, ऐसा कुछ नहीं हुआ ना उस time पे people. So there were a lot of things written, discussed. But of course, Patel's death, Gandhi's death, Nehru was educated in the West, and so to a large extent his ideas did prevail at the end. And we also have to understand the larger context outside India also, about this whole modern times, right? So when we are talking about the term modern, what does it really mean to you? What characterizes modern? I know modern architecture may you will have some. So what characterizes modern for you? What era, what are the elements that you will say, okay, these are the 3-4 things that dominate the modern time. Now we say it's postmodern, right? So what is the difference?
the modern area. So construction planning would be the development of buildings using RCC and big sites. That was a problem. So like architects like can actually focus on this a lot in the modern approach. But now the
So why
postmodernism,
RCC and concrete?
because they consider
Exposed concrete, right?
they're considered modern materials, right? Because they're used so extensively back.
Anyone else?
The
What?
other
What was the essence of that time? What was the philosophy that prevailed at that time, which said, okay, हम तो इसको ऐसे ही रखेंगे, expose ही रखेंगे. आजकल ऐसा नहीं रखते, बहुत कम दिखता है ये आजकल ना. We don't see it, right? Okay. Machinery was the trigger, yes. Make it, efficiency, industrial efficiency, assembly line, right?
that's what the other
Right. So authenticity was a big this thing. The brutal. But we are not veneering it with anything. We are not covering. Ornamentation was not there because in the West, and of course it's in some adaptive form here also, we wanted to break from the tradition. So everything tradition, so we put that as a binary, tradition, modern. Right? So we were breaking with the older ornamentation period and we're saying no ornamentation as it is. Right? But that is one part. Anything else? So machines and etc. What all it is in terms of thought process, what would that mean? Yeah. So another prominent character is mass production would mean what? What did we need to do for mass production to happen?
Setting up more factories, so more people move, migrate into cities.
Okay. So we needed to standardize. No, standardize. So this whole standard-based प्लानिंग में वो ऐसे आया. बाकी चीज़ों में आपके वो सारे एंथ्रोपोमेटिक्स came in, right? All your standards, they are all result of modern thought. And there was this larger thing of, it was called an enlightenment project, that through rational thought process, we could achieve human progress. So rational thought, because computers just I theory, just stuff, right? So that is where this whole, and आपके operations research और वो सारा जो efficiency से related जितनी भी चीजें थी, they all started to come in at that time. So these 3-4 things became very typically what would be a modern time. Rational planning, rational thought, logic की बात करेंगे. In every discipline, you pick up sociology, you will find it. You pick up politics, not politics so much. You could pick up administration, you will find Weber talking about, in organization, how we will do things logically. In planning, it came as rational plan making. So the scientific reason, basically under the rational plan making was the thought about everything that can be observed and the scientific reason, जिसको हम experiment कर सकते हैं and we know it will produce the same results, only that will be considered as truth. Okay? So there was a notion of universal truth. And that is what is the contrast with postmodern, which says that it's subjective truth. There is no universal truth. Different people have their own subjective truth. Reality might be somewhere in the middle, but this is what defined modern, right, at that time. And that was the so centralized planning. If you would look at these statements, it reflects that period. It reflects that. So it talks about while there is a need for concentrating effort on more immediate problems, planning implies the readiness. This is I have taken from the first 5-year plan. It's a preamble of first 5-year plan, which talks about that we have to take a view of social process as one whole and to take action designed to shape this process along desired lines over a defined period, future oriented. And planning is essentially an attempt at working out a rational solution of problems. And after that, rational, this thing has been criticized a lot. We no longer, which is an attempt to coordinate means and ends, efficiency and whatever ends that you decide. So this is first chapter of your first 5-year plan. So we choose a centralized planning approach. Just tell me when the time is over. And if you guys are getting bored, you please ask questions. But I just want to also bring to you, we criticize a lot. I also want to just kind of remind us where we were at the time of independence. Right? Our literacy was 26%. And our average lifespan was 32 years. So we have made progress, right? It's not like we may not be happy with a lot of things, but let's just kind of go back and see where we were and where we've come. Our infant mortality rate was 165 per 1,000. So this is just to kind of tell you that it's not that nothing is done. Even if to many of you it may seem so, because we still see a lot of poverty. So this we have kind of discussed, that purpose of planning in different contexts. It changes from extraction of resources to nation building to economic growth and to sustainability in current times. All right. So I'm not going to get into this details here, but let me just tell you that before independence, so town planning is this institution of town planning is a very recent phenomenon. The comprehensive town plans, like master plans that you people now are so familiar with, it's just come back after independence. They're not even 100 years old. And before that, we were having town planning laws, but they were schemes. So the laws were only applicable on small schemes for development. They were not applicable on the whole city. Now imagine the change that it brings. So what a town planning law does is, what does it do? What does a town planning law does? And because the thing is, we take these things so much for granted that we have forgotten what it does. We just take it so much for granted. So much, it's normal. It's very recent actually. The 100 साल भी नहीं हुआ. What does it do? It brings in a major shift. And what do you think that shift is? All of you are familiar with town planning laws? Right? Okay. That's like philosophical, but what does it do on ground? What power does it have? Town planning law.
So a blanket rather than pocket.
Yeah. So what it does is it regulates what I can do on my private property across the city. And that's a huge power. It was not there before. I could do whatever I wanted to do before that, by and large. I have to regulate it. But now, with a comprehensive plan, the whole city I can regulate what can happen on my private land. So in the 60s, somebody challenged this. When the first in Gujarat, they said we will regulate through town planning law, we will regulate what you can do on your plot. So this person, it's a very famous case. It went to Supreme Court that state doesn't have a power to regulate private property because I have a right, आपने मुझे right to property दिया है and I also have a right what I can do on that property for my livelihood or whatever. So then the court said no, the state under this state list number 18 and concurrent list, it covers economic and social planning, and under which then the town planning law gets covered. That state has a right to regulate, and that's when the town planning gets so much of power. It becomes statutory, plans become statutory, and now we take it normally. हाँ ये तो होता ही है, हर शहर में एक मास्टर प्लान होता ही है, ऐसा कुछ होता नहीं था. So पहले what we were regulating was only the nuisance. Industry का जो nuisance था, we were only regulating that. Your zoning regulations were like, मान लो leather industry है या आपकी कोई स्मेल की कोई इंडस्ट्री है, तो वी वर रेगुलेटिंग कि भैया आप ये यहाँ नहीं लगा सकते, यू हैव टू पुट इट समवेयर एल्स बिकॉज इट बेसिकली आप न्यूसेंस को आपको मिनिमाइज करना था. पहले स्लॉटर हाउस है तो यू हैड रेगुलेशन स्पेसिफिक टू दोज एक्टिविटीज, बट विद दिस नाउ वी डू मच मोर दैन जस्ट प्योरली रेगुलेटिंग न्यूसेंस. Now we talk, so we bring in what we call our sense of order, we bring in a whole lot of other things which now are normalized. Right? And that begins to happen after independence. Because town planning draws from, now, it essentially draws from public health. Right? Congestion of cities, that is the origin for town planning laws. Right? So this map here just basically tells how now all these states, almost all the states have town planning laws, and the dark green ones were the ones which were there up to 1960. And then we have 1960 to 80, the whole expansion of town planning laws happens between 60s to 80s. Okay? Rajasthan doesn't have a town planning act, it has an improvement trust act in which they have incorporated preparation of master plan. So master plans get prepared now everywhere. Another thing that we were also dealing with is we already had colonial laws. Right? We had land acquisition, we had improvement trust laws, So different states now develop their own flavor of town planning laws, right? Like Haryana, I think it does. It doesn't have a town planning law, right? It follows the Chandigarh का जो है आपका नहीं नॉट मास द एक्ट वो जो बिल्डिंग रेगुलेशंस वाला जो है ना आपका नहीं नॉट बिल्डिंग रेगुलेशंस इज इट कॉल्ड it's not called a town planning act, it's called something else, I'm forgetting. So Haryana capital regulation building capital it's a नाम है इसका roads and building act चंडीगढ़ का जो है चंडीगढ़ रोड्स एंड बिल्डिंग रेगुलेशंस एक्ट है capital what is it called roads and building regulations I think just yeah you could just look at बोला Chandigarh I'm forgetting
Regulation of urban areas.
that is हुडा का है ना that's the development authority act but development authority आपका master plan is done by town and country planning in Haryana but like Chandigarh also doesn't have a town planning like Himachal town planning act or Punjab urban and regional planning act what is it called Punjab scheduled roads and right so under that act Chandigarh Punjab has its town planning act right अब Chandigarh का master plan का तो contested story I'm sure most of you would know right it went to Supreme Court Chandigarh का तो master plan went up to Supreme Court I think और हमारा पंजाब शेड्यूल्ड रोड्स में मास्टर प्लान प्रिपरेशन का कोई बहुत ज़्यादा जिक्र नहीं है उसमें सो दे डिडंट नो कि अंडर विच एक्ट नाउ टू प्रिपेयर अ मास्टर प्लान तो आई थिंक दे इशूड अ सेंट्रल उससे वो सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट से फिर कुछ नोटिफिकेशन इशू हुआ एंड देन सम प्रोविजंस वर इन्वोल्व्ड तो उसके अंदर बना तो दैट इज़ व्हाई बिकॉज हम तो वो लीका गुजे वाला मास्टर प्लान ही लेके चल रहे ना कि वो बन गया जोनिंग थी हमारी वी हैड दो जोनिंग शीट्स अब आगे क्या करना है उसका कुछ प्रोविजन नहीं था सो बट बाय एंड लार्ज मोस्ट ऑफ द स्टेट्स अडॉप्टेड यूके टाउन प्लानिंग लॉ आया 1947 एंड अ लॉट ऑफ इनिशियल राउंड ऑफ टाउन प्लानिंग एक्ट्स वर बेस्ड ऑन दैट which basically introduce your preparation of comprehensive plans. टाइम मुझे बता दो यार मैं तो how much time do we have? All right. So one we have the laws and second we set up the planning institutions, right? Development and which were mostly technocratic institutions. The idea at that time was कि हमको पॉलिटिक्स से इसको अलग करना है प्लानिंग तो हमने so we created these development authorities in the 80s 70s we had this जैसे housing boards which came in so they were mostly bureaucratic and technocratic predominantly and contrast it with now after your 73rd and 74th amendment we are now going back and saying let's abolish development authorities now municipal corporations will do the planning right so that's a shift again back to a more political form of planning so we create so basically the decades after independence was spent a lot in creating your laws and institutions. And of course, plans were prepared, but not so much. Delhi becomes one of the really good examples. Mumbai, of course, happens. New town plans get prepared. All your steel towns, refugee towns, all that happens. But the expansion of planning as a profession happens up till 80s. institutionalization and expansion. So now I shift. So in the 90s, we have our 74th Amendment. So briefly, let me also give you the period between the late 60s and the 80s. Now, major political crises happen during this time. Global energy crisis, oil crisis happens. पैसा खत्म हो गया आपके पास. Emergency happens at a national level. So now all that has implications for planning institutions in the sense of we don't really have resources. And we also, unemployment takes a toll. Strikes हो रही है आपकी, रेलवे स्ट्राइक हो रही है, जनरल इकोनॉमिक स्लो डाउन है. So from this whole last 2 decades where we were into this whole hopeful mode कि हम चीजें बदल देंगे, a disillusionment begins to set in. We are disillusioned कि ये तो जैसे सोचा था वैसा हुआ नहीं है. The promise of modern India is kind of, you have riots in one of the steel towns, I think in Jamshedpur or some such place. Steel town story is really very interesting, but right now I'm not getting into that. Both refugee towns, आपका ये नीलो खेड़ी ने और कुरुक्षेत्र वगैरह, they were really very, very interesting experiments. I mean, something you really need to read up about. Not well documented. This period actually is not very well documented. We have a lot of literature on colonial and we have a lot of literature on postmodern. But this 60s, 40s to 80s का जो period है, we don't really have much. Even modern architecture में भी अगर आप देखें, you will find very little documentation. Colonial की बात मिल जाती है. So this was a difficult one, but it is very interesting once you begin to dig in. Particularly steel towns, कौन consultants आए, किसको आप IITs get built, SPAs get built. SPA was mentioned in the first 5-year plan that we need to set up a school of planning. So we are setting up educational institutions, we are setting up these industries, large industries. And by the end of 60s, आपका states का reorganization हो गया, political turmoil हो गया, railway strike हो गई, energy crisis हो गया, emergency लग गई. So things look bleak in this period. It's Hindu rate of growth. This period is called very slow rate of economic growth.
It also put a lot of change in political ideology.
Change in the sense?
In the sense that post Nehru's demise, the push that his ideology had, because Patel and Gandhi's ideology was sort of got sidelined for contemporaries. And at that point, you still had those politicians who were actually freedom fighters who were still saying, okay, let's keep the country together. But this,
so fragmentation began to happen. अगर आप end 60s वाला time देखें, when Indira Gandhi was kind of fighting कि भाई मेरे को leadership चाहिए, so all that is happening. We amend our constitution and poverty के ऊपर बहुत कुछ, slum redevelopment. World Bank, international agencies move in. World Bank का major slum programs come in. So, but this period overall, if one was to sum up, from planning perspective, it was an expansion of planning, but it was also coming in touch with the reality on ground. वो slums तो बड़े ही चले जा रहे हैं, कुछ नहीं कर पा रहे हैं. Economic की economy भी doldrums में लग रही है. And then of course your period of opening up starts in the 85 onwards. तो आपने कहा कि अब हमें अपनी इकोनॉमी खोलनी है, and that's when now the shift begins to happen in the way we were looking at this whole centralized planning, top down, 5 year plans. वहाँ से आपका अब चेंज होना शुरू होता है. And now you know that we don't have 5 year plans, right? So we've come पूरा उसका डिसबैंड हो गया है. You know, मतलब that planning एक टॉप लेवल पे जो हम प्लानिंग करते थे, allocation of funds, all that now no longer happens. That's a whole trajectory we have taken. So yeah, so in so we 90s another thing that happened is, I think maybe इसको मैं थोड़ा जल्दी से कर लेती हूँ. So now we have special purpose vehicles in terms of institutions, because I want to come to the planning ideas a bit, right? This most of you are familiar with, right? Garden City movement. This is, we have discussed some bit of it. These are new towns that we built in this, you know, capital towns, industrial towns, and refugees towns. Almost 120 new towns of varying types were built. And of course, comprehensive planning. This was, we are talking 60s. And so in the 70s, the focus on region began to come. That we said, city ka problem we can't solve within the city. We have to look at regional specific solutions. So decongestion of cities, IDSMT, all those programs began to create. We started to move. So many regional plans. So our acts also changed to accommodate the region. That we have to prepare regional plans now. And now we come to the current this thing that we अब हम कह रहे हैं कि planning तो चलो जो कर रहे हैं सो कर रहे हैं. We are now focusing, most of current paradigm is we need to do projects, large projects, right? So there is a projectization that's happening. So while we are preparing master plans, but three things that define: one is focus on infrastructure, large infrastructure projects. Focus on large privatized townships, right? You gift city ho gaya, this Delhi Mumbai industrial corridor ke along ke developments ho gaye, and they are, most of them are gated development, and that's another shift that happens. Of course, these are current key concerns on sustainability, water security, pollution. So the initial table was on colonial and pre-colonial. This is the same table, but post-independence and post-liberalization. So let me just kind of end here, right? Because there is a whole lot and we could perhaps go on. But let me just kind of open it up for, we are on time, is it? Yeah. So this is just a very quick overview of what we have. So you can, if you want to ask something, you feel free to ask. You can comment on it also. You don't have to ask it. What you think? What is your understanding of how things are evolved in architecture? Maybe. How do you see this in parallel to architecture? Because planning you may not be very familiar with. But see it if this kind of resonates with what happened in architecture. So if you look at how the architectural form has transformed, then do you see any parallels? Do you see similar threads?
There is a good example. So if you look at it, it is actually handed over to the British. So Bombay was a food thing, we did food water.
Yeah.
And the general population actually lived on salsa outside the food. But as soon as the cotton industry started, so there were migrants coming in, the regular guys were already split up. So there were migrants from the south coming to Bombay. There were Chinese people living in Bombay, who were still living there. It was the bottom thing. And as soon as the Mumbai expanded, the store was actually taken down to actually construct the marine drive and all these places. And later you actually see how land was reclaimed from the ocean between Mumbai again, and the suburbs also.
Yeah.
I think it's a very good plan. And in between all of this, British actually started the Indo-Saracenic style, which became the BMC, became all these,
Yeah.
to actually give that sense of identity to the people. So,
Yeah, it wasn't like they just completely brought in. I think what we were
Yeah,
talking.
so-
It's not like it was pure European colonial architecture. They kind of adapted.
And another interesting thing was British actually also worked on the report in which they actually identified the flora and fauna of the country and tried to integrate it into their Gothic
Yeah.
style buildings, right? So that's why there's an independent Gothic style of architecture is still going on the way. So I think those local buildings actually helped a lot in some sense.
So Sidco planning, for example, was basically to decongest Mumbai.
Yeah.
And it started sometime in the 40s actually, but the first plan got prepared in the 70s, and it was the first. And 70s we see a lot of these industrial development corporations coming up. uh, Industrial estate planning happens a lot, so
So like they will actually plan all of this Belapur housing projects and also the artist village in Belapur. I think these two are very common projects.
Yeah.
In various ways. And also Charles Fourier put on the mills.
On-
How to
on-
use the mills. So all this started coming in.
yeah, in the 70s, all this housing for low cost housing technology, all those things become a focus. But even in architecture form, if you see, let's say the shift in the form from what we see in after independence to what we see now is a reflection of this shift from a more modern this thing to a more, so the form reflects that. uh, so where earlier perhaps the state institutions held a much more prominent places, like let's say in Delhi, Vikas Minar, right, is the most prominent building in this thing. And now you see your offices or your IT, this thing, the trade or the commerce buildings, glass facades and all. So there is, I mean, even in architecture, you will see the similar response to a certain socio-political and economic context.
Direct response to the economy of the
Right.
localized style of architecture.
Yeah. So it is a response to a larger context. Architecture planning also is a response to a larger context. So that is why we can't look at architecture or planning outside its context. Of course, the materials develop, the technology develop, all that is happening, but we are responding in a certain way. Why gated communities have become? We didn't have that. Huh? So let's, for example, take an example of your sector 17 and Elante. Right? Of course, the scale is very different. But okay, let's say maybe smaller market. Let's take sector 10 or 11 ka market. Like if you are familiar with Delhi, let's take Nehru Place and Saket Mall. Okay? It's a response to a certain context. And that, good or bad, that we need to look at. So what does gated community does, or what does a space like mall does vis-a-vis a space like Nehru Place does?
Yeah, I think aspirations also shape our cities, right, in some way. So, for example, the SRA development schemes which are happening throughout the country. Mumbai was one of the first.
Mumbai is the first one.
And also then again Mada House, which is again some related to SRA. So all of these are coming around, but then again there's a big gap between the aspirations and what is happening in the development plans, right? So you'll have cases of these EV patients coming up with these SRA houses, right? Because of the bad development, bad planning.
Yeah, okay.
So it's a very typical scenario, which happened all across India in the 90s, I think. Actually, multiple times. So I think 5 times it has happened. So.
SRA, I think Mumbai, but we have tried it in Delhi. I mean, those kind of SRA in Mumbai has a very different kind of this thing. I don't think we have, like we call it a Mumbai model, like those private high-rise developments. But Delhi is starting with it now. Yeah, which has
SR is just that. The people are
yeah,
put in
yeah.
these
You
modes in the
gentrify
buildings
the
and they get
place.
to land resources.
You gentrify the place. So any other?
Malls coming up is a direct consequence of like the middle class coming up. So you have more purchasing power. Such a mall comes up like in
And the
small.
global, global aspirations that we have. All the global brands are there. Yeah. So what it does now to spaces, let's say for vendors. See, they're not vanishing. They're not vanishing, but malls don't have a space for them. But Nehru Place had. Nehru Place had. You could do that. So, so that's kind of a question for us also as professionals, right? That are we going to only respond or also are we going to also shift? So are we just going to respond to the economic forces or do we also have transformative role or not? Because if we are not going to deliberate on these things, then what we are creating is very segregated spaces. Like you look at Gurgaon, you have fantastic gated communities, and then you step out of that community and you have streets which don't function the way they should function, right? So what happens to public spaces is an issue, isn't it? And so how are we responding to it and how should we respond to it and what is the in-between available to us? What are the options available to us? I think it's something that's where I want to leave you with. Otherwise, we are just going to end up responding to it. Yeah, this is what the client wants. This is what I'm going to do. Right?
Actually, I want to add one thing. As man started with the discussion with the partners of planning. So, if you, she mentioned about the improvement trusts. So, Calcutta Improvement Trust was set up during the British period in
1916, 15, 16.
So the purpose for the institution was development of certain urban areas, like looking up to the streets, putting up street lights, looking up to the drainage, then creating some organized markets. All those were for the benefit of the British rulers because they wanted, because Calcutta was that time the capital of India, so they wanted that it should have the impact of the Western style of living. So that was the purpose. So they had institutionalized those kind of activities at that time because that was not there in our system as a indigenous or traditional planning concept. So that was one purpose. Now presently when we look at like as one just talked about Gurgaon, so we talk about the global cities and the global communities which are there, which are completely dependent on a different type of economic setup. We don't have the agrarian economy as such. We are now all into that IT professionals and all. So those global cities having those offices over here, the different brands coming over here. So that is again a different purpose for which that planning is coming. And because of that, we also have this. We always talk about this TOD, the transport-oriented development. So we are having the metro as a development route. So or any such expressways or whatever. So those are the routes of development. So transport-oriented development comes because we are promoting or we are connecting different nodes for the purpose of economic growth. And as a result, the planning is coming up in this in a different pattern, a different fashion with the different partners. So these things also need to be looked after. And as professional planners, there is always a compromise which had to be there because either there is something from the top coming up that this is a general rule for all the development strategies throughout the country, which may not work. Each region, each town, each maybe a municipal area, they have their own agenda, so they cannot fit into those things. So when the professionals come in between, they have to have a framework which is designed by some organization, but they also have to satisfy the aspirations of the people. So here the role of us, our professionals come over there. But how do we balance these two things and how do we satisfy the aspirations of the people over there? So that needs to be understood. So we cannot stop by creating gated communities or just by creating those type of pockets at different zones which are not having relevance with the region. So this context of this regional planning also came up to accommodate these small pockets within the general framework of development strategies.
Just to kind of from Calcutta, I'm reminded because the book we talk about Delhi, Chennai, Mumbai, and Calcutta. They four have very different planning styles and strategy. Calcutta, particularly, is very different with their structured plan compared with Delhi, which is a comprehensive plan. So each state actually develops its very own unique flavor as a response to. So Calcutta never really went with comprehensive plan. They didn't do comprehensive plan. Mumbai also had a very different approach because it always had a regional perspective. So Mumbai metropolitan region, region development. So Delhi did initially, of course, we did have a regional thing like the master plan does make a mention of it, but it was still more of a. So DDA, no, the Town and Country Planning Office started this thing, but the plan was done by Ford Foundation in Brazil. That's another very interesting story. So, you know how much money was paid to them. Albert Mayer was the leader of the Ford Foundation team who kind of did the plan comprehensive. The first one in 62, which was done in 62. Of course, then later on it came to TCP and then to DDA. But the initial Ford Foundation team was headed by Albert Mayer. So, yeah. So that's what. So you read the book. Rest if it kind of makes you more curious, you can always, of course, read it.
Actually, I mentioned in the beginning, it is like a textbook.
Yeah.
So at the end, the appendix portion and those things they have already mentioned. Each and every terminology is defined. So it is a very ready reference. Whenever you are stuck with some terminology related to planning and all, you can flip through that and complete definition with the paragraph or something. So very nice section. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Anything else you want to add? Any questions?
I'm always very conscious of the fact that many of you come from architecture. This thing sometimes I don't know how much the planning this thing is engaging enough for you, but at least it will give you a sense of that there is something much broader within which architecture is also embedded. So you are also like your regulations and your zoning would control how your architecture forms will come. So it's important for you to understand these, not just the history of town planning, but actually how town planning functions. The ground reality of it, because you will be facing it when you go in the field. You will have to read a master plan to understand it. Important for you to just know this a bit more. Okay. Thank you.